I want to tell you, I got to tell you some farm story this morning because it's comical, and I know you might be getting tired of it, but our little hobby farm of all of 2 acres is getting to be a comedy show at times, and so bear with me a little bit. So some of you know that we've got all these animals, and one of the things I had to do at our house was to work on our barn. When we bought our house, this was what the barn looked like. It had an open side. And as you can imagine, Michigan winters, animals, that doesn't really work. And so I've been working to try to close that in, and it's been quite the process. I had to, over the winter, we made this temporary thing, and so if you were at our house, you saw my hillbilliness, and it looked straight out of West Virginia, I'll admit. That's okay. And if you're from West Virginia, I'm sorry. That's where my sister-in-law's from, so I make fun of it all the time. And so we had to dig some post holes. I put the boys to work. When we had the outdoor service, I told you my kids know what that is because they've used it. And so we've dug some post holes. We've set some posts. I put a new door in the end, and that looks really pretty now. And I've been slowly putting siding across the front, and then I'll have to paint it actually to match because, believe it or not, the cream and brown color scheme is no longer popular. You know that color scheme from 1982? Yeah, it ranks right up there with the burnt orange, like, I don't know, the pews in here or something. And so I've been working on that, but here's the problem I encounter every time I work. You see where I'm working, and the problem is right there. There's 3 critters in with me. Now, I don't know if you've ever tried to do a project around something other than a cat or a dog, but they are insanely curious critters. They're critters. The goats are notorious. We hear about they eat cans and stuff like that. The goats are actually really persnickety eaters, but they are like a baby in that they will put anything in their mouth, including my tools, screws, nails, or anything they can get their little mouths on while I'm out there working. My pant leg. And so it's been really a challenge working, but one of the things that's really kind of comical to me now, Oreo, the black and white one, the mom, she has an insane fear of my stepladder. And I mean insane. I walk into the pasture with it and she runs. And if you've ever seen a goat who is in milk run, it's entertaining to say the least. It's like a waddle, we'll call it that. And so she can't run well, but she runs the other way, and it comes back to, there was a time a couple months ago when I had it out and I was working and had it up, and she decided that she wanted to climb it. She has this thing when she tries to, the goats will climb anything, totally true. You put anything out there, they're going to try to climb it. When they're babies, they'll try to climb you. But she tries to climb the thing one time, and it fell over. And I don't think it hit her, but it scared the snot out of her. And ever since then, she has an insanely irrational fear of that ladder. And so it's great because when I'm working, if she starts getting a little bit annoying, where she's just there like grabbing at my bucket with the nails in it or whatever, I just rattle the ladder and she takes off and she's scared to death. But the reality is, we as people can very often develop the same kind of irrational responses to things that come along in our lives. Now, yes, I just did compare you to a goat. I realize that I pastor sheep, not goats, but sheeps. That's not even a word. I'm doing good this morning. But the reality is, we do this thing where we interpret bad things that happen to us, and we can really develop these really irrational fears. And in my years, I've been in ministry for 12 years now, in the Christian and Missionary Alliance total, if you include my part-time youth pastor director days. And the one thing that's always blown me away is 2 different people encountering very similar life circumstances, how one can go through it really well, trusting God, and how the next person can develop really bad habits and run away from God, or even develop just really irrational responses to things that come into their lives. And a lot of times, the reactions are nothing to do with the actual problem. My goat, Oreo, my goat. It's Wendy's goat, okay? We should clarify that. It's not my goat. It's Wendy's goat, Oreo. The problem was not the ladder, right? A ladder in itself is nothing to be feared. The problem is that it's not made for a goat to climb. And so, it was that she was somewhere she shouldn't be. She was sticking her nose into something she shouldn't have, and that's why she had gotten scared. And it's the same thing as people. And so oftentimes we have this thing where things happen to us, and we develop these irrational responses to things that come along that maybe weren't even the root problem. Now, how does that tie into the book of James? Last week, as we introduced the book of James, we talked about, James says, consider it pure joy, my brothers, when you face trials of many kinds. And I ended the message saying that how we respond to bad things that happen to us, how we interpret them, is critically important. We can interpret them in the deep work of character that it does in us. We can interpret them in light of how it draws us close to Christ. Or we can interpret them from a worldly perspective and allow it to really change us in not a good way. And so as we continue in James, we're going to be looking at verses 5 through 11 this morning. So if you want to follow along, we're in James chapter 1, starting in verse 5. James starts to talk to us. So he starts to talk to us about this issue of wisdom. And now I kind of laughed as I thought about using the goat story for an intro, because the goats, they lack wisdom, okay? There's no wisdom, and there's not an ounce of it in their bodies. They're weird and stupid and... Oh, I'm not repeating that, Mike. But they are. And James here writes in verse 5, he says this. James says, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. Listen, James, what he's saying is, listen, if you're having trouble correctly interpreting your trials and your temptations, the things that come into your life, he's saying, listen, you need wisdom from God. This is what you need to interpret these things correctly. And so this really ties into last week, that how we respond to the things that come into our lives is really rooted in who do we seek for the answers. One of the most frustrating things in the life of a pastor is when people come to you and they tell you they sought out this person, that person, their mom, their dad, their brother, their sister, their cousin's aunt's wife's nephew, twice removed, and then they come to you and they say, listen, this is my problem. This is what everybody says. Pastor, tell me what you think. And I ask this question, have you asked God or sought out his word of what he thinks? Well, no. Where we go to for the answers to life's problems greatly determines how we respond to them. And James here is saying, listen, when things come along, you go to God and you ask for wisdom. Now, wisdom, it's interesting. If you look at Google's definition, so if you Google wisdom definition, it's going to come out with this. It says, the quality of having experience, knowledge, and good judgment, the quality of being wise. You got to love those. What is wisdom? Being wise. Google's so smart. The soundness of an action or decision with regard to the application of experience, knowledge, and good judgment. So I get like the second part of that. It's not just having knowledge. Listen, I know people that have knowledge, but they make the same mistakes, right? So one of the things I'm doing on my barn is metal siding, and I've got to do a lot of trim work before I can put the main siding on. And I have these little roofing nails that I have to drive through the trim before I put the other metal on and put the screws with the rubber bushings on them to seal everything up. And you know what I did this week? I was driving one time, and the angle wasn't right, and I missed the nail. I hit my fingers, and I yelled. I did not yell anything bad. I just said, ow! And I yelled it, and I'm sure my neighbor heard it. But you know what I did? I picked up the nail, and I held it the exact same way and swung again. I bet you know what happened. Wendy looks at me from the house, right? Having knowledge and using it are two different things, right? And so I get that. The last one, I really start to question the body of knowledge and principles that develops within a specified society or period. That's scary. Society doesn't determine wisdom. Now I want to give you if you would ever get your personal copy of Pastor Matt's Hillbilly Dictionary, it has terms like hogwash and those things in it that you guys love so much. But if I were to define wisdom, I think a better definition is the ability given by God to see situations from his perspective. Because any earthly wisdom, it doesn't matter, right? Because this earth, when it talks about like a society or something, our society tells you that homosexuality is okay. It tells you a lot of things that are good that are not good in the counsel of the Almighty. True biblical wisdom is seeing things from God's perspective and then acting upon it, I believe. If you can see it from God's perspective, but you act in a way that is against his will, then that's not really wisdom. That's knowledge without any application. And so, biblical wisdom, what James is saying, when you are in hard times, you need to be able to see things from God's perspective, and that's a gift you can only get from him. Ask God, he says, and God who gives generously to all without reproach. Now listen, this without reproach, it could be interpreted without hesitation, without finding fault. It's also used sometimes to say without uttering insults. Listen, this is saying like you know the person that when you come to them for advice, there are people you've probably run into in your life that if you ask them for some advice on a situation, they'll give you advice and they'll also insult your intelligence while they do it, right? They like to get the little dig in. Like, why are you so stupid? You need to ask this. And James is saying, listen, God isn't like that. You know, there's also people you've probably experienced in life that when you ask them a question or you ask them for advice, while they're giving the advice, they want to bring up all the stupid things you've done in the past. I've had it, right, where you ask for advice and the first thing, well, if you hadn't done that, you wouldn't be in this situation in the first place. You been there? And what James is saying, listen, God is not like that. When you come to him asking for wisdom, he does it without reproach. He doesn't insult you. He doesn't bring up all your past offenses. He gives generously. Because he wants you to be wise. He wants you to see things from his perspective because then you can act according to his will. And so no matter what your background, no matter what your previous record, whether you've screwed up every time up until this point or you are the definition of just the saint and the model of Jesus Christ, either way, if you come to God asking for wisdom, James says he gives generously to all without reproach. God's generosity is spontaneous, it's unwavering, and there are no strings attached. He gives generously. Now, I read earlier from Luke 11, and Jesus talked about this idea of going to a friend at midnight and how God will give you the Holy Spirit. Listen, you need the Holy Spirit in your life, working in your heart to have the kind of discernment you need to interpret trials correctly. God will give his Spirit freely to those who ask him, who are found in his name. Now, James goes on to say, but let him ask in faith, with no doubting. For the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. Now, this is one of those verses that when I hit this week in my study, it ended up taking about the next 4 days of my week because I had to resolve the issue of what does it mean when it says doubt. Because there are far too many churches out there, right? That when it comes to sickness or things we're praying for, if you aren't healed, you doubted. You didn't have enough faith. It's your fault. There are churches that preach that. I had a good friend when I worked at the prison who was an officer at the prison, but previous to that had been a pastor. And when his mom died of cancer, his peers came around him and instead of consoling him, said, listen, you didn't have enough faith. It's her fault and your fault for not having enough faith. That's why she died. And it drove him from the church and from God, and I still pray for him every so often because I don't know where he's at. But when James says, let him ask in faith with no doubting, we need to understand what he's talking about. When we talk about faith, I love Pastor Reibling's definition he used the whole time I was here. Taking God at his word and acting upon it. Faith requires action, and we're going to get into that in James later with works and deeds and faith and things. But what we need to understand, when he talks about faith, he's talking about live, active faith, things that responses come out of a place of trusting God. And when he talks about doubt, if you look at the root word here, he's not talking about intellectual doubt. You know, this verse used to beat the snot out of me, and I know I'm not the only one, that you've been there, right? Where you have those fleeting moments of like, I'm not sure if this whole thing I believe in is totally true. You know, when I was a young person in high school and stuff, it really was evident. You come to those times, or maybe you doubt, God, are you going to do something here? But listen, that kind of like fleeting thing, the intellectual thoughts that come in, I do not believe are the kind of doubt James is talking about here. We see that kind of doubt actually throughout Scripture. In Psalm 13, David says, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? Do you hear him? He's saying in his prayers, he's saying, Lord, are you just never going to answer? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? David said this is when he's running from Saul. He's hiding in caves and stuff. He has been anointed by Samuel the prophet as the next king of Israel, and he's hiding in a cave. I think he has every logical reason to doubt, God, when are you going to do something? Are you going to do something? You made this promise to me, but I see no evidence of it. And I think when we talk about trials and tribulations that James is talking about, there are times in our lives when from our human perspective, we cannot seem to conjure up any bit of a glimpse of God. And if we're honest, that happens. And what James is talking about here is in those times you need God's perspective. You can't see it from your shoes. And then David, he says, consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Light up my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death. Do you hear it? Lord, I'm going to die if this keeps up. Lest my enemies say I prevailed over him. Lest my foes rejoice because I'm shaken. But hear the end of what David says. He pours out his whole self. He says, but I have trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. I think in this psalm we see David go from a place of intellectual doubt where his mind is saying, listen, my reality says God's not here, but I will choose to take godly wisdom into consideration, and I will say the Lord has dealt bountifully with me. In the midst of struggles. When he talks about doubt, James is talking about a waffling back and forth. He's talking about not having a single-hearted integrity towards the matter. In Mark 11, Jesus used actually the same root word here when he says, truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will come to pass, it'll be done for you. Therefore, I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it'll be yours. When it says, do not doubt in his heart, this is the same word. And so Jesus even went at this idea to doubt that is to distinguish, is to hesitate, to waver. And I actually, Chuck and I were talking about this last night in the hospital. This is a matter of where is your allegiance of your heart? When James says that if you doubt, what he is saying is, listen, if you, in the midst of your trials and struggles, You say, listen, Lord, you obviously don't got that, and you put your heart's trust in something else, yourself, another person, finances, whatever it is. That is the kind of doubt he's talking about. It's a heart shift. James goes on to say, for that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He's a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. James is not saying if you come up here for prayer or for healing, and you have those fleeting thoughts that the enemy is trying to stick in you about, will the Lord answer this? I don't know. James isn't talking about that. He's talking about as you're up here, you decide in your heart, you know what, God's not going to do this. I'm just going to, my faith and trust is in the doctors and everything they can do. And if they can't come through, nobody will. That's the kind of heart shift I'm talking about. It doesn't preclude going to a doctor or going to, seeking out the technology of our day, but it's a matter of where's your faith and your trust. When it says he's a double-minded man, literally like double-hearted, two allegiances to multiple places is what James is saying. In Deuteronomy 26:16, God warns about this. He says, this day the Lord has commanded you to do these statutes and rules, right? Talking about his stuff, the things of the Lord. And he says, you shall therefore be careful to do them with all your heart and with all your soul. God really strongly warns all the way back in Deuteronomy, listen, this thing of faith and following God, you're either all in or you're out. Because if you're not all in, that's what he's talking about. That's a double-heartedness. Psalm 12:2 talks about this as well. When it says that everyone lies to his neighbor, their flattering lips speak with deception. That speaks with deception is literally they have like a double-heartedness towards each other. And so that's a good example. This, to get an idea of the kind of doubt, this is the person that when I come over here to Mike, hey Mike, you're like my best friend and stuff, and you're cool. He rides a motorcycle. He is pretty cool. And then I come over here and I'm like, hey Justin, that dude over there's an idiot. I hate him. That's a doubleness, right? It's a double two-faced. We talk about that. That's what James is talking about. He's saying, listen, you cannot have your allegiance to God and then throw your heart's allegiance in with something else. That is the doubt that he's talking about. A double-minded man. This kind of person, they cultivate not a true faith, but it's like a patina of faith. One of my favorite shows right now, I like to watch American Pickers. I like watching all the old antiques and stuff. And what's really comical to me is, there's all these people now that when they fix up like an old car, they want the patina, right? They want it to look old. So they'll take like brand new metal that they put on and put a lot of effort into making it blend in. And then they put acid and paint and all kinds of stuff on it and make it look old. And what James is talking about is kind of like that, really, right? That part of the car is not really old. It's a patina, it's fake. And he's saying, listen, when you put your heart in two places, when you doubt when you come before the Lord, especially when it comes to asking for wisdom, it's just a patina of faith. It's not real. One of the things, one of my favorite stores, Hobby Lobby, they're really good at making stuff look really old, right? But under that, a lot of it's like particle board and stuff. It's really cheap. It's not the real thing. And that's what he's saying. James is saying, listen, you are called to be the real deal, not the Hobby Lobby fake version of the real. Nothing against Hobby Lobby. I love Hobby Lobby. And there's my cabinet in my office, the one that looks really cool and old, it's from Hobby Lobby. It's not old. The double-minded man, this person is unstable. They're not at rest. They're not settled. They're never committed. And this is the person who doubts. Now, James, when he moves into verse 9 here, he says some things interesting that scholars are all over the place. A lot of people don't like these verses, which is funny. I love reading that. Well, I don't really like these verses. They don't seem to fit. Well, James wrote them, so they obviously fit, and it doesn't really matter whether you like something in the Word of God. It's there. Verse 9 through 11 says this, "Let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation, and the rich in his humiliation, because like a flower of the grass he will pass away. For the sun rises with its scorching heat and withers the grass. Its flower fails and its beauty perishes. So also will the rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuits." There is debate out to wazoo, or out to Kalamazoo, however you want to say it. In the Jewish faith, there was a deep understanding and theology of the poor. Now, in the culture that James wrote, we need to understand, when we talk about poor and rich and stuff, there was in that culture mostly the rich, like the people that really had some money. None of y'all would fall into that category that I know of. And then there was the poor. Like, they're having trouble figuring out what they're eating their next meal. All of us, like people, we fall in the middle, the middle class. That didn't exist. And there was this idea, though, that these people that were rich, they tended to put their heart, their trust in their wealth, right? And I think as middle class, we have that temptation too, because, world standards, we are wealthy. We're very, very wealthy. My wife drives a van that's a year and a half old. We're wealthy. There's places where people, they don't even know, like, they're tying bottles to their feet for shoes, right? But James here is kind of playing that when he says, "Let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation." There was this idea in Jewish culture that being poor was a blessing from God because you tended to have a more God-focused outlook on life. You had to trust God for everything. And so there was this idea that it was a more righteous place to be. And the truth of the matter is, when things get really hard, it does bring into perspective what's really important and what's really not. We're praising God for the illnesses that and the things that God is working in our church, that God is bringing healing. But the reality is, you can one moment be talking about arguing maybe with your spouse over which, or maybe not arguing, you have a discussion over which soccer league your kids are going to play in. But then the kid falls outside and splits her head open, and guess what? You don't give a rip about what soccer league they're playing in. All you're worried about in that moment is what's really important. Is my kid going to be okay? Do we need to take him to the hospital? And this is coming from a guy that Josiah has been to the hospital many times because he's a little rambunctious, and he's done crazy things like running across the driveway, not looking where he's going, and hit my bus I used to drive. Wendy had a fun time explaining that at the hospital. No, he hit a bus, not a bus hit him. Why did he get hit by a bus? And there you go. No. He hit the bus. The bus was parked. But the reality is those things tend to bring to the surface what's really important. And so what I think that James is saying here is when he says, "And the rich in his humiliation," he's saying, listen, if you are wealthy and God brings something into your life to humble you, you should rejoice. Because God is bringing to the surface the things that are truly important. You should rejoice. So if you're lowly, if you don't have it, if you're struggling like crazy, he says boast, you be excited. And if you are rich and you are humiliated, you should be excited as well, because God has allowed something in your life that is going to do a work on your soul. And he goes on to say, the sun rises in scorching heat and withers the grass. Listen, riches fade. You can't take nothing out of this world. It's really not that important at the end. And he says, so also will the rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuits. Listen, if your heart's pursuit is after the things of this world and riches and stuff, he's saying, listen, you're going to fade away. But rejoice if the Lord allows something in your life that brings you down. Riches have the capacity to dull our sight until we cannot see God. Riches can woo us into like an uncritical acceptance of the standards of the world versus the rightful standards of God. And so one commentator wrote this. He says, trials will either relieve the rich man of his encumbrance or shock him back into the reality of what's really important when he talks about trials. So at the end of the day, when we look at this section of James, my question for you really is this. How do you respond in the dark times when God seems absent? Now, I mentioned last week that word for trials, that can be just bad things that come into your life. That can be temptations. So maybe your dark night of the soul is not necessarily that you have a major crisis on your hand as far as physical things happening. Maybe your dark night as a soul is that you have this sin issue that just keeps rearing its ugly head, and you constantly feel this temptation, and you ask God, why am I even being tempted? James says, call on the Lord and ask for His wisdom, ask for God's perspective. In the parable of the prodigal son, Jesus, illustrated really well this guy, right? He leaves home, spends all of his inheritance that his daddy gave him, and at his lowest point, he's feeding swine and wishing he could eat what they had. And I think that the aha moment of that story for him is when he says, I will go back to my father and ask to be a servant. And that's what James is saying. Listen, in those deep despair moments, do you get angry? Do you lash out? Do you begin to try to find ways yourself to fix this? Or do you run desperately back to your Heavenly Father and ask Him to lead and guide and to give you wisdom? How we respond to the trials and tribulations, temptations that come into our lives is significant, it's important, and it can greatly change the kind of men or women of God that we become. I hope that when things come into your life that you just run back to God and say, God, I need your wisdom. I need your perspective so that no matter what comes, I'm looking at this through your eyes.